Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 150, which is a huge number and I can't believe we hit that, but the name of this deck is Opponent Assisted Voltron. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card, either from scryfall.com or from a suggested card from viewers, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our deck comes to us from Richard over on Discord/Patreon, and the card that he has suggested for us is the Brute. Now, I will be perfectly honest, I hadn't even heard of this card before Richard suggested it, but it is a pretty cool card that honestly kind of works a little outside of its color identity, because it is 1 and a red for an enchant creature. It's an aura. Target creature gets +1/+0. It says target, but it should be enchanted creature. And red, 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 regenerate target creature the Brute enchants. So this is a mono red regenerate card, which is not super common, particularly on auras. And so the problem became with this, what can we use the Brute on to really benefit from protecting whatever it is that the Brute is enchanting? And the title of the video may have given it away, but we decided to add a color to it and work a little bit with some unique synergies in red and, in this case with our commander, black, because our commander is a Rakdos commander, Xantcha Sleeper Agent. She is 1 black-red for a 5/5 Phyrexian minion. She enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of your choice. She attacks each combat if able and can't attack its owner or planeswalkers its owner controls. And any player can pay 3 mana to make Xantcha's controller lose 2 life and draw a card. So you can kind of see where we're going with this. We can enchant Xantcha with the Brute and then still have the ability to pay to regenerate her, because it doesn't give Xantcha the ability to regenerate, it gives the Brute the ability to regenerate the creature that it's enchanting, which we still control. So if someone tries to, say, board wipe, or someone tries to remove Xantcha, we have a way to protect it, and we don't have to rely on our opponents not just swinging this into something that could kill it. Now, with that being said, let's take a look at some of the themes of this deck and what we're really trying to do. So first up, if we're giving Xantcha to our opponents, we obviously need to make sure that we are benefiting more from that than our opponents are. And the best way we can do that is with enchantments like Lust for War. Because Lust for War is 2 and a red for an enchantment. It's an aura, enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature becomes tapped, Lust for War deals 3 damage to that creature's controller, and enchanted creature attacks each turn if able. Now, that last line of text is not super relevant because Xantcha already has to attack every single turn, but being able to do 3 damage to Xantcha's controller every single turn means that we're kind of winning the game on 2 separate fronts. We're doing 3 damage to the person who controls Xantcha, but because they have to attack somebody, we are pressuring the rest of the board without actually doing anything. We don't need to have creatures in play. We don't need to be attacking. We can just let our opponents do it for us. Ideally, Xantcha knocks out 2 of the 3 players, and then Lust for War kind of whittles down the last remaining opponent until we're able to clean things up. So that is mostly what we're trying to do, but you might be thinking, well, Xantcha's only a 5/5, she doesn't have indestructible, there's a good chance that she just gets blocked and killed, and that is where theme number 2 comes in, which is of course finding ways to buff up Xantcha. We want her to be taking people out of the game, and the best way for us to do that is to make her a little bit stronger, because a 5 power commander is going to take 5 hits to be able to knock someone out of the game, and that is way too many for what we're trying to do. We want to make that at least 4, preferably 3 if we can, and to do that, we're going to use some unique cards such as backgrounds, because backgrounds specifically care about commanders we own, not commanders that we control, which is something we've made use of before. We built a Corona deck completely around backgrounds, so if you're interested, go check that out. But the idea is that we can use something like Agent of the Shadow Thieves to really make Xantcha just completely run over the rest of the table. So Agent of the Shadow Thieves is 1 and a black for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have, whenever this creature attacks a player, if no opponent has more life than that player, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. It gains Death Touch and Indestructible until the end of turn. This is exactly what we're looking for Xantcha, because it allows our opponents to attack each other, and no matter what's happening, as long as it's attacking the creature, the opponent with the most life, obviously not a creature with the most life, then she's going to be getting Indestructible and Death Touch, so she's surviving combat no matter what. And that is exactly what we want to be having her do. Now, again, with all of this being said, this is great in theory, right? We are attacking with a bunch of stuff, or our opponents are attacking with a bunch of stuff, and we're hopefully doing what we want to be doing. But we may need a little bit of extra value on top of that. And that is where theme number 3 comes in, which is Enchantress. And I know that's a weird thing to say because we are in Rakdos colors, and the vast majority of Enchantress style cards are going to be in green and in white, but we can still make do with what we have, because some of what we have is very powerful, such as, for example, Grim Guardian, which is 2 and a black for a 1/4 enchantment creature, zombie. Constellation, whenever Grim Guardian or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses a life. Now, you may have noticed we've got auras, we've got regular enchantments and backgrounds, we've got enchantment creatures. Since we are loaded up so heavily with enchantments, it only makes sense that Grim Guardian is going to put in a ton of work and start draining people out very, very quickly. Plus, we have other cards that do similar things that care about when enchantments enter the battlefield. And even though we are putting our auras onto Xantcha and we do not control Xantcha, we will still control the auras that are attached to her, which will trigger our Constellation and our Enchantress effects, which is incredibly important for this deck. Now, with all of that being said, those are our major themes for this deck. The next thing that I would like to do is take a look at some key cards in this deck. These are the cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and whether or not they're win conditions on their own, they at least help us push toward a victory. Now, the first key card that we're going to talk about is going to be Hateful Eidolon. And Hateful Eidolon is 1 black for a 1/2 enchantment creature spirit. They've got lifelink. Whenever an enchanted creature dies, draw a card for each aura you control that was attached to it. Because we're really going in on making sure that Xantcha is unblockable or indestructible or has death touch or hurts an opponent or whatever, that means we are loading Xantcha up with enchantments and kind of setting ourselves up for failure. Because if we put our entire hand on Xantcha, she's got 5, 6, 7 enchantments on her, and someone just removes her from the battlefield, all of a sudden we are completely out of luck because we just wasted everything on a creature and that creature is gone. Hateful Eidolon lets us rebuild when that happens because it doesn't specify that we have to control the enchanted creature, we just have to control the auras that are attached to it. And we will control the auras attached to Xantcha, so if she dies and has 5 auras on her, we get to just draw 5 cards, which then probably lets us redeploy Xantcha, put some more enchantments on her, and just keep going. So Hateful Eidolon is one of the most impressive card draw effects in the entire deck, and even though it doesn't look like much, coming down early can really benefit us in the long run. So that is key card number 1. Key card number 2 is a little bit different, but this one synergizes perfectly with Xantcha specifically, and that is Heartstone. Heartstone is 3 mana for an artifact. The cost of each creature ability requiring an activation cost is reduced by 1. This cannot reduce an ability's generic mana cost to less than 1. Now, obviously, this doesn't work with everything, so we can't use it with the Brute because it is 3 red mana. However, Xantcha's ability to draw 3 cards is very important. Or I suppose spend 3 mana to draw a card. It would be much better if she drew 3. But to draw a card for 3 mana means that we can activate it now for 2 as long as Heartstone is in play. And while the difference between 2 and 3 mana doesn't seem like a lot, it really adds up over the course of the game. Because now, even just if we want to spend 6 mana, we're drawing 3 cards instead of 2, and that really accelerates the game plan. Plus, the other thing you have to keep in mind with Hearthstone is that this is a universal effect. It actually counts everybody's creatures, so everybody can activate Xantcha for less mana, meaning we can drain out the person who controls Xantcha much quicker. So if you're in a situation where you can't really deal with what someone is doing, maybe they've got too many creatures or maybe there's too much going on, you can give them Xantcha and the table can work together to just slowly drain that person out, refill the hands. It's a great way to kind of get yourself out of an archenemy situation, and people will appreciate that you're willing to do that. So that is why Hearthstone is definitely one of our key cards. And finally, our last key card for the deck is Blessing of Leeches. Again, a enchantment that doesn't really look like much at first glance, but it becomes an absolute all-star once you see what it can do in a game. So Blessing of Leeches is 2 and a black for an enchant creature. It's an aura. You may play Blessing of Leeches anytime you can play an instant. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life, pay 0, regenerate enchanted creature. This is almost universally one of the best protection spells we have in the entire deck for Xantcha, because we can just pay 0 to regenerate her, which means she's pretty much safe from any destruction effects. Now, obviously, someone could exile her, we could have someone sacrifice her, or someone could do something like a Wrath of God that says you can't regenerate creatures. All of these things are very possible, but there's not a ton of indestructibility in red and black, particularly when it comes to auras. We could use some equipment to do it, but we can't equip equipment to a creature we don't control, so we can't actually equip it to Xantcha. Now, with that being said, we do have to lose a life in our upkeep with Blessing of Leeches, but if we're being perfectly honest, 1 life a turn is not the worst thing in the world to have what is essentially the best form of protection for our commander. So Blessing of Leeches doesn't look like much at first glance, like I mentioned, but it really pulls its own weight in this deck and is an all-star for what we're doing. Now, with all of that out of the way, those are our key cards. The next thing we've got to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize well with each other and sometimes just kind of create fun and valuable interactions on the board for us. Not usually so much for our opponents. It's usually pretty bad for our opponents, but you never know. Maybe sometimes it'll be good for them too. The first one, though, let's be perfectly honest, is not going to be great for our opponents because it is Ashiok's Reaper and Malevolent Witchkite. And yes, I know they're both from the same set. They're both from Wilds of Eldraine, so obviously they could synergize together. But let me explain it a little bit. So Ashiok's Reaper, 3 and a black for a 3/3 Nightmare. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. And Malevolent Witchkite is 4 black for a 5/4 Dragon Warlock. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice any number of artifacts, enchantments, and or tokens, then draw that many cards. You can kind of see what this is going to be doing. If we have Ashiok's Reaper in play, maybe we've loaded up Xantcha with a bunch of different enchantments. Let's just say for the sake of this, she's got 5. Then we cast Malevolent Witchkite, comes into play, we sacrifice the 5 enchantments on Xantcha. Both the Witchkite and the Reaper are going to draw us 5 cards, so we just draw a total of 10 cards right there. And yeah, it is unfortunate that we then have to get rid of all of the enchantments that are on Xantcha. We've got to rebuild and do it again. But we just drew 10 cards. There's a very good chance that in those 10 cards, there are more auras we can put on Xantcha, and we can just kind of keep accruing value because no matter what, now we have a 5/4 flyer, which is very good, and Ashiok's Reaper is going to keep drawing us cards. Plus, we've got ways to kill some creatures and bring them back, so we could just kind of loop this. There's a lot of shenanigans that can happen here. But the most important thing is just how efficient and effective this card draw engine can be on the right board state. So with that, we're going to take a look at our second cool interaction, which is going to be between War's Toll and Silent Arbiter. Now, initially, both of these cards are going to be very good for the deck in different ways, because, for example, War's Toll here is 3 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, tap all lands that player controls, and if a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that opponent controls attacks if able. Silent Arbiter is 4 mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 1/5. No more than one creature can attack each combat, and no more than one creature can block each combat. So let me explain how these work individually, and then we'll talk about them together. So War's Toll helps us in a couple of ways when we're talking about Xantcha. Because if an opponent taps their mana and they have to tap all of their mana, they're not going to want to let it go to waste, meaning they'll probably spend it on Xantcha activations even when they don't necessarily want to or need to, because it's better than letting the mana go to waste. Additionally, if they attack with a creature, they have to attack with all of their creatures. Xantcha has to attack every single turn, so the opponent that controls Xantcha is forced to attack with all of their creatures every single turn, and that can be absolutely devastating for them if they've got a bunch of mana dorks or they have their commander that's pretty small and things like that. It can really set people back. Silent Arbiter is almost the exact opposite. It only allows one creature to attack each combat. If the person with Xantcha has Silent Arbiter in play while they have Xantcha, they can only attack with Xantcha because Xantcha has to attack. That forces everything else to sit back and do nothing. So if you have an opponent with a huge board state and you want to shut them down, Silent Arbiter forces only Xantcha to get through. And if you have an opponent with a board state that you would love to see attack but they just refuse to do it, War's Toll does that as well. Now, the reason these are here together, though, is because they have conflicting lines of text. Silent Arbiter only allows one creature to attack, and War's Toll says all creatures have to attack. Because those conflict with each other, when someone goes to combat, their creatures essentially say they cannot attack because they all have to attack, but only one can attack. So essentially that means nobody is attacking anybody at the table except for us. We could attack and our opponents can still only block with one creature, which is very relevant for us, but it means that we can kind of sit back and just drain someone out with Xantcha, maybe even take that player out of the game, take Xantcha, give it to someone else, do it again, take her back, give her to the third person, and do it again. We can almost play a bit of a control game plan in Rakdos colors, which is not something you see very often. So anyway, I think I've talked about this enough. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of weird, unique interactions like this. So with that being said, for our cool interactions, we are going to move on to the final piece of this deck tech, which is taking a look at the price of the deck. Now, this week, the price came in at $61.74, so not super cheap, but not super expensive, a little bit over the halfway point of our budget. And for one of the first times on this channel, the most expensive card in the deck is actually a land, and it is Homeward Path. And you might be looking at this and wondering why this is here, but I will explain. It's just going to sound a little complicated. So Homeward Path is a land that taps for a colorless mana, but it also taps to allow each player to gain control of all creatures they own. This sounds weird because why would we give Xantcha away and then try to take her back, especially with a land that costs $10, a land that if we cut it from this deck puts us almost to our 50% of the budget limit. That puts us to almost $50. Why would we want to take Xantcha? Because then other people can use it to drain us, and then we're not using it to kind of get in at our opponents. And the short answer is that sometimes we just kind of have to. Sometimes our opponents might try to do something with Xantcha that we can't let them do, whether it's sacrificing it, maybe they've got a free sacrifice outlet in play, or maybe it's something that is going to cause us problems. But the most common reason we're going to want to do this is because if we give Xantcha to a player and they eliminate the other two players at the table, we are then stuck staring at a Xantcha that can't attack. But if we take it back for ourselves, we can then use Xantcha to take out the last remaining player. That may not always be the case, let's be perfectly honest. You could always just use Xantcha's ability to drain the other person out, but sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. So that is why this is in here, and that's why it's taking up such a big portion of the budget. However, if you do need to trim and you are not as concerned with taking Xantcha back, you can cut this and trim the price of the deck down to about $50. On the other hand, though, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that is out of budget, and when I say out of budget, it's technically just more expensive than the deck already is right now. It's not going to push us over $100 because I'm not going to suggest a $40 card. And as people who watch this show pretty regularly know, I try to avoid staples when I can, which would be the super expensive cards. I do, though, have a suggestion for kind of a quality of life upgrade, and that is Ghoulish Impetus. Now, we have pretty much every other impetus in the deck that we can run. We have all of the vows. We're happy to goad our opponent's creatures to prevent them from attacking us. The only one we don't have, because it is just so much more expensive than all the others, is Ghoulish Impetus. And that is 2 and a black for an enchant creature, enchantment aura. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, has death touch, and is goaded. And when enchanted creature dies, return Ghoulish Impetus to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So this is essentially an impetus that keeps coming back, and no matter what happens to the creature it's enchanting, we just get to keep goading things at the table. Plus, giving a goaded creature death touch is brutal for the opponents, because that means they're either forced to block it and lose a creature or take the hit, neither of which is appealing. So Ghoulish Impetus really is awesome and does deserve a spot in the deck, but like I said, I just didn't want to spend too much money on it, so we left it out of the original build. If you do decide to put it in, though, the card that I would recommend taking out is Blightcaster. And it's weird to suggest Blightcaster because at 3 and a black for a 2/3 human wizard, it says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you may have target creature get -2/-2 until the end of turn. That is one of the few cards that cares about enchantments in the Rakdos colors, so it feels weird to suggest cutting it. But honestly, in my multiple games with this deck, I realized that it doesn't quite do as much as you want. Coming down at 4 mana means that you've already got Xantcha in play. You really want to be spending that turn casting auras. If you get it down late, which it's 4 mana, it's probably coming down a little bit late, then you're really not able to kill too many things at the table, and there's a good chance you're only casting 1 or 2 enchantments every turn anyway, so you're never really going to get more than a -4/-4, and that's putting in quite a bit of work. So I'm a big fan of Blightcaster. I have seen it do amazing things. I just don't think this is the deck for it. I think you're really looking for a deck that plays a bunch of tiny enchantments to really rack up on that -2/-2. And unfortunately, this is not that deck. We're playing pretty big enchantments every single turn, so not quite what we're aiming for. If you choose to keep Blightcaster in, it is still a great card and will still do some cool things, but I do think in the long run, Ghoulish Impetus is going to be better for the deck if you don't mind spending a little bit more money. Now, with all of that being said, I think it's finally time we move on to the gameplay of this portion of the video to see how this deck performs in a game against 3 opponents. Before we get to that, though, we gotta take a second to highlight some ways that you can support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So, as always, we have our social media accounts. You can find us on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, and you can send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. But if you're looking to support us a little bit more directly, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get a ton of amazing things like access to the deck lists a week early. You get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks, and also that's where we record the videos. So if you want to be in the videos on this channel, that is the easiest way to do it. You'll get a random card sent to you every month. You'll get to see the unedited gameplay footage. And of course, my personal favorite part of this is that once you are a Patreon or a channel member, I give you a guarantee that any cards you suggest will be turned into videos for this channel eventually. It might take me a while since I work pretty far in advance, but I will get to them. Of course, I will try to get to everyone's suggestions, so if you have some, please leave them in the comments, send them to me on an email, send them to me on Reddit, Twitter, whatever. I would love to get to all of the suggestions. I love doing suggestions. They're some of my favorite videos to make, but I can't promise to get to them in the same way I can for our patrons and channel members. So if you're interested in that, please do check us out, and you can join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to all of you, thank you all so much, and if you would like to have your name listed among these amazing people, please do check us out. If that's not your style, or you just can't afford it right now, I completely understand. I still appreciate you watching the video. You can always like it, subscribe. That is just as amazing. So thank you all so much for helping us get to deck number 150, which still blows my mind. But I suppose I've rambled quite enough. So let's take a look at our opponents for this week's video. Now, obviously, we have 3 opponents this week where we are going to be testing out our Xantcha opponent-assisted Voltron deck. And this week we are being joined by Doodle, who is playing Yorion Sky Nomad, Richard playing Ishin 2 Heavens as 1, and Jason playing Anakthea Hand of Erebos. So starting off with Doodle and his Yorion deck, this is actually a mono-white Yorion deck, so he could be playing blue, he is choosing not to. And it is, other than that, exactly what Yorion wants to be doing. It's a ton of blink effects and flicker effects. He wants to have creatures with enter the battlefield effects that he can then exile and bring back and trigger again. And so this is going to be a ton of value. And I think looking at all of these, this is probably the one that I'm the most concerned about. I personally also have a Yorion deck in my own collection, and it is absolutely brutal for the table, so I imagine that even though mono white, it's still probably going to put in a ton of work. Next up, we have Richard, who actually suggested our card for this week's video, so he gets to play against his own suggested creation with his Ishin deck. And his Ishin deck is a little bit different than the traditional just turn things sideways and hit your opponent's Ishin. He actually built it more of a pillow fort deck. There's a lot of cards that say when a creature attacks you or when a creature an opponent controls attacks, do this thing. So he's built around those in the attempt to kind of force his opponents to attack or block and then get some sort of value out of it, which sounds very cool to me. I'm very excited to see that deck. And then last but not least, we have Jason playing Anakthea. This is a unique twist on Enchantress, where instead of having the typical blue to go along with the white and green, we have black. And this allows Jason to really play heavily into the graveyard shenanigans that Abzan can provide, but also in a way that Enchantress kind of can toy around with. So he obviously has the normal Enchantress like cast an enchantment, draw a card, make a token, do all of that fun stuff, but he also gets to turn his enchantments into zombies with his commander, adding a little bit of a unique twist to it. So Enchantress is always very powerful, and I am very excited to see what he can do, especially because graveyards is kind of Jason's specialty. So with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments how you think this game is going to go. Get your predictions in now, and then of course let me know if you predicted correctly. So let's jump into this game, see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by Richard, Jason, and then myself. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Richard plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling Doodle's graveyard. Jason plays a Murmuring Bosk. I play a Smoldering Crater. Doodle plays a Scavenger Grounds and casts Felwar Stone. Richard plays a Command Tower and casts Tome of Legends, which gets a page counter whenever his commander enters the battlefield or attacks, then he can remove a counter from it to draw a card. Jason plays a Bountiful Promenade and casts Seal of Primordium, which can be sacrificed to destroy target artifact or enchantment. I play a Swamp and cast Fire Diamond. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Spirited Companion, drawing a card when it enters the battlefield. Richard plays a Fetid Heath and casts his commander Ishin 2 Heavens as 1, doubling an ability of his permanence that is triggered by a creature attacking. This also puts a counter on the Tome of Legends. Jason plays a forest and casts Assisted Champion, which lets him draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on it whenever an enchantment enters under his control. I play a mountain and cast my commander Xantcha Sleeper Agent, which enters under Richard's control. Doodle casts Core Cartographer, searching his library for a plains and putting it onto the battlefield tapped. Richard plays an Exotic Orchard and casts Guild Artisan, letting him make 2 treasures when Ishin attacks an opponent at the highest life total. He then attacks Jason for 5 with Xantcha and attacks me for 3 with Ishin, putting 2 counters on Tome of Legends and making 4 treasure tokens. Then in his second main phase, he activates the Tome of Legends, removing a counter from it to draw a card. Jason plays a Sun Petal Grove and casts Destiny Spinner, preventing his enchantments and creatures from being countered. This also triggers the champion, so it gets a +1/+1 counter, and Jason draws a card. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 2 with Assisted Champion. I play a Swamp and cast Unquenchable Fury, enchanting Xantcha, so whenever she attacks she deals X damage to defending player, where X is the number of cards in their hand. After that I cast the Brute, also enchanting Xantcha, so she gets +1/+0 and can be regenerated for 3 red mana. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards when it enters. However, if an opponent attacks him with an unblocked creature, they gain control of it, untap it, and draw 3 cards. Once that resolves, he casts Act of Authority, exiling Unquenchable Thirst. Richard activates the Tome of Legends on his turn, removing a counter from it to draw a card, then casts Duelist's Heritage, letting him give target creature double strike until the end of turn whenever creatures are declared as attackers. He moves to combat, attacking Jason for 6 with Xantcha, giving her double strike, and attacks Doodle for 3 with Ishin. This has Richard putting 2 more counters on Tome of Legends, making 4 treasures, gaining control of Coveted Jewel, untapping it and drawing 3 cards, while Jason blocks Xantcha with Destiny Spinner, killing it but taking no damage. In his second main phase, he plays a Spectator Seating and casts Martial Impetus, enchanting Jason's Assisted Champion so that it's goaded and, when it attacks, gives his other creatures +1/+1 until the end of turn. At the end of turn, Jason casts Grisly Salvage, looking at the top 5 cards of his library, putting a land or creature from among them into his hand, which ends up being a Starfield Mystic, then puts the rest into his graveyard. Still at the end of turn, Jason sacrifices his Seal of Primordium to destroy Richard's Duelist's Heritage. On Jason's turn, he plays a Brushland and casts Starfield Mystic, making his enchantments cost 1 less to cast, and putting a counter on it whenever one of Jason's enchantments goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. He then casts Grim Guardian, making each opponent lose a life whenever it or another enchantment enters under Jason's control. This also puts a counter on the champion and lets him draw a card. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 3 with Assisted Champion. I play a Mountain and cast Agent of Erebos, exiling target player's graveyard whenever it or another enchantment enters under my control, this time exiling Jason's graveyard. Once that's resolved, I cast Bloodthirsty Blade and pass. Doodle plays a Plains and attacks Richard for 1 with Spirited Companion, but before blocks, Richard casts Wear and Tear, destroying the Coveted Jewel and Act of Authority. Then he takes 1 damage. In his second main phase, Doodle casts Preston the Vanisher so that whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under his control and wasn't cast, he creates a 0/1 illusion that's a copy of that creature. On Richard's turn, he casts Sun Titan, returning Duelist Heritage from his graveyard to the battlefield. He attacks Doodle with Ishin and attacks Jason with Xantcha, giving them both double strike with Duelist Heritage and also letting Richard make 4 treasure tokens. Then Jason blocks with the Starfield Mystic, while Doodle blocks with Core Cartographer. Before the damage though, Doodle casts Flicker of Fate, exiling Core Cartographer and returning it to the battlefield, letting him search his library for a Plains and put it into play tapped, also triggering Preston, so he makes a 0/1 copy of the Cartographer, searching his library for another Plains and putting it into play tapped. Then Jason's Mystic dies and neither player takes damage. Jason casts a Sanctum Weaver, which can tap for mana equal to the number of enchantments he controls. This triggers the Setessan Champion, letting Jason put a +1/+1 counter on it, draw a card, and triggers Grim Guardian, making each opponent lose a life. He plays a Forest, and attacks me for 5 with the Champion. In his second main phase, he casts Calyx, Destiny's Hand, activating his +1 ability to look at the top 4 cards of his library, reveal an enchantment from among them, and put it into his hand with the rest being put on the bottom of his deck. This has him getting Grasp of Fate. On my turn, I play a Bojuka Bog, exiling Richard's graveyard, then cast Shiny Impetus, enchanting Sun Titan, goading it, letting me make a treasure token whenever it attacks, also exiling Doodle's graveyard. Then I activate Bloodthirsty Blade, equipping it to Setessan Champion, giving it +2/+0 and goading it. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Felidar Guardian. In response though, Richard casts Chaos Warp, shuffling Doodle's Preston into his library, letting him reveal the top card of his library, putting it into play if it's a permanent, which it is, so he puts a Field of Ruin into play. Then the Felidar Guardian resolves, exiling Core Cartographer when it enters the battlefield, immediately returning it to play and searching his library for a Plains, putting it into play tapped. Once that's resolved, he casts his Commander Yorion Sky Nomad, exiling all of his creatures when it enters the battlefield, returning them to play at the beginning of the next end step. He immediately moves to his end step, returning all his creatures to play, which has him drawing a card, searching his library for a Plains, putting it into play tapped, and again exiling Yorion, exiling all his other creatures until the beginning of the next end step. Richard immediately moves to combat, attacking Doodle with Sun Titan and Xantcha, giving them both double strike while I make a treasure. Before blocks, Doodle casts Generous Gift, destroying Sun Titan and letting Richard make a 3/3 elephant token instead. Then, Doodle blocks Xantcha with his illusion token, killing it and taking no damage. In his second main phase, Richard activates Tome of Legends, removing a counter from it to draw a card, and casts Combat Calligrapher, letting any player who attacks one of his opponents make a 2/1 Inkling token that's tapped and attacking that player. At the end of turn, all of Doodle's creatures return to play, so he draws a card, searches his library for a Plains, and attempts to exile Yorion again. In response, Richard casts Generous Gift, destroying Yorion and making him a 3/3 elephant token, so Doodle doesn't exile his board again. On Jason's turn, he casts a Grasp of Fate, making each opponent lose a life, drawing a card, putting a +1/+1 counter on Setessan Champion, then exiling one non-land permanent for each of his opponents until it leaves play, exiling Agent of Erebos, Felidar Guardian, and Tome of Legends. He plays an Overgrown Farmland and activates Calyx's +1 ability, putting Shigeki Jukai Visionary into his hand from among the top 4 cards of his library, with the rest going to the bottom. He then casts the Shigeki, putting another counter on Setessan Champion, drawing a card and making each of his opponents lose a life. He attacks Doodle for 7 with the goaded Setessan Champion, making 2 Inklings that are also attacking Doodle. Then Doodle blocks with the Spirited Companion, killing it and taking 8 damage since the Inklings are given +2/+2 by Martial Impetus. At the end of turn, I pay 3 mana to activate Xantcha, drawing a card and making Richard lose 2 life. On my turn, I cycle a Baron Moor, play a Smoldering Marsh, and cast Blightcaster, giving target creature -2/2 until the end of turn whenever I cast an enchantment. Doodle plays a Mary of the Sky Ruin, letting him return a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield in his upkeep as long as he controls 7 or more planes, which he does. He then casts Sun Titan, returning Spirited Companion from his graveyard to the battlefield when it enters, also drawing a card when the companion enters. He also cast Moonblessed Cleric, searching his library for an enchantment, in this case Touch the Spirit Realm, putting it on top of his library. He also recasts his Commander Yorion, exiling all his other creatures when it enters the battlefield, returning them to play at the end of turn, which happens immediately, letting him draw another card, search his library for a Plains, putting it into play tapped, and search his library for an enchantment, specifically Teleportation Circle, putting it on top of his library. Richard plays a Restless Fortress and casts Fervent Charge, giving his creatures +2/+2 until the end of turn whenever they attack. Before combat, Jason casts Anguished Unmaking, exiling Ishin and losing 3 life. Then, Richard attacks Jason with Combat Calligrapher and Xantcha, giving the Calligrapher double strike, making an Inkling token, and giving his creatures +2/+2 until the end of turn. Then Jason blocks Xantcha with Grim Guardian, killing it and taking 12. On Jason's turn, he plays a Plains and activates Calyx's +1 ability, looking at the top 4 cards of his library, but unfortunately not finding an enchantment to put to his hand, putting them all to the bottom. He then activates Xantcha, drawing a card and making Richard lose 2 life, and then casts Sigil of the Empty Throne, putting a counter on the Cetessan Champion, drawing a card, and also now creating a 4/4 Angel token whenever he casts an enchantment. Then he casts Growing Ranks, drawing a card, putting a counter on Cetessan Champion, making an Angel token, and allowing him to populate in his upkeep. He moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 9 with Cetessan Champion, which also gets double strike from Richard's Duelist's Heritage, and he makes an Inkling tapped and attacking, but Doodle blocks with Spirited Companion and Yorion, killing the Inkling and Companion, taking no damage. At the end of turn, I activate Xantcha, drawing a card and making Richard lose 2 life. On my turn, I play a Rogue's Passage and cast Agent of the Shadow Thieves, so whenever Xantcha attacks a player and no opponents have more life than that player, she gets a +1/+1 counter, Death Touch, and indestructible until the end of turn. This also triggers Blightcaster, giving Moonblast Cleric -2/2 until end of turn, killing it. In Doodle's upkeep, Emeria triggers, returning Spirited Companion from his graveyard to the battlefield, letting him draw a card. He also casts Teleportation Circle, letting him exile a creature he controls in his end step, then return it to the battlefield. He casts Angel of Condemnation, which can tap to exile a creature and return it to play in the next end step, or tap and exert itself to exile a creature until the angel leaves play. He activates Xantcha, drawing a card, making Richard lose 2 life, then cast Evangel of Heliod, creating a number of 1/1 soldier tokens equal to his devotion to white, which is currently 10. He attacks Richard for 4 with Yorion and attacks me for 6 with Sun Titan, returning Moonblast Cleric from his graveyard to the battlefield, searching his library for an enchantment, specifically Cathar's Crusade, putting it on top of his library and creating an Inkling token that's attacking me for 2. Second main phase, he sacrifices Field of Ruin to destroy my Rogue's Passage, letting each player search for a basic land and put it into play. At the end of turn, I activate Xantcha, drawing a card and make Richard lose 2 life. Then Doodle's Teleportation Circle triggers, letting him exile Evangel of Heliod and make 10 more soldier tokens when it returns to play. Richard casts Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs, letting him make a 3/3 Ogre token when an opponent attacks him with a creature and doesn't pay 3 mana. He then attacks Doodle with Xantcha, giving her +2/+2, Death Touch, Indestructible, Double Strike, and a +1/+1 counter, while also making an Inkling token that is tapped and attacking as well. Doodle blocks both creatures, killing the Inkling and his own Evangel, but taking no damage. In Jason's upkeep, he populates with Growing Ranks, making an Angel token, and activates Calyx's -3 ability, exiling Teleportation Circle until Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. Jason then casts Demon of Fate's Design, letting him, once per turn, cast an enchantment spell by paying life rather than mana. Since it's an enchantment, he also draws a card, puts a counter on the champion, and makes an Angel. Once that resolves, he pays 3 life to cast Grim Guardian, making each opponent lose a life while he draws a card, puts a counter on the champion, and makes an Angel. Notably, he wouldn't have been able to do this as the Guardian was in the graveyard at the time, and the demon does not let you cast spells from the graveyard, but we don't catch that at the time. He then casts Casualties of War, destroying an artifact, enchantment, creature, land, and planeswalker, so he winds up destroying Emeria, Angel of Condemnation, Bloodthirsty Blade, and Martial Impetus. In response, Doodle channels Touch the Spirit Realm, exiling Angel of Condemnation and returning it to the battlefield in the next end step. Then Casualties resolves and destroys all the other targets. Finally, at the end of turn, Angel of Condemnation returns to play, and I activate Xantcha, drawing a card and making Richard lose 2. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Arcane Signet, then activate Xantcha again, drawing another card, making Richard lose 2 more life, and cast a Citadel of Pain, making each player lose life equal to the number of untapped lands they control in their end step. This also triggers Blightcaster, giving Moonblast Cleric -2/2, killing it. Then I pass my turn, taking 3 damage in my end step for the Citadel. Doodle plays a Plains and activates Xantcha 5 times, drawing 5 cards and making Richard lose 10 life. He then casts Scroll of Fate, letting him tap it to manifest a card from his hand, which he immediately activates, manifesting a card. Once that's resolved, he activates Angel of Condemnation, exiling Yorion and returning it to play in the next end step. He moves to combat, attacking me for 6 with Sun Titan, returning Touch the Spirit Realm from his graveyard to play, exiling Sanctum Weaver until it leaves play, making a tapped Inkling token that's also attacking me. Then Richard uses Duelist Heritage to give the Sun Titan double strike. I block the Titan with Blightcaster, killing my creature and only taking 2. At the end of turn, Doodle's Yorion returns to play, letting him exile all his other creatures, including the Manifest, which was actually an Angel of Serenity, returning them all to play at the beginning of the next end step. On Richard's turn, he recasts his commander Ishin and attacks Doodle with Xantcha and also attacks me with Kazul. This lets him make 2 more Inkling tokens and attacking each of us, while Xantcha and Kazul both get +2/+2 and double strike, and Xantcha also gets a +1/+1 counter, Death Touch, and Indestructible. Doodle blocks Xantcha with a Soldier token and the Inklings with Yorion and his own Inkling, taking no damage, while I can't block, taking a total of 11, getting knocked out of the game, but not before I leave a lasting mark, activating Xantcha one last time to draw a card and make Richard lose 2. In Richard's second main phase, he casts Search the Premises, letting him investigate whenever an opponent attacks him. Then, at the end of turn, all of Doodle's creatures return to play, letting him draw a card, search his library for a Plains, putting it into play tapped, returning Field of Ruin from his graveyard to the battlefield, and exiling Setessan Champion, Kazul, and Combat Calligrapher, returning them to their owner's hands when Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield. Jason activates Calyx's +1 ability, putting Verduran Enchantress from among them into his hand and the rest on the bottom. Notably, Calyx only gets enchantments, so he couldn't have done this, but we don't catch that at the time. He then casts the Verduran Enchantress, letting him draw a card whenever he casts an enchantment. He pays 2 life to cast Sanctum Weaver from his graveyard, making each opponent lose a life, drawing a card and making an Angel token. He casts Enchantress's Presence, letting him draw another card when he casts an enchantment. Since it's also an enchantment, he once again makes each opponent lose a life, draws a card, and makes an Angel. After that, he casts Despark, exiling the Angel of Serenity, returning Kazul, Setessan Champion, and Combat Calligrapher to their owner's hands. He moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 26 damage with all of his Angels, the Demon of Fate's Design, and 2 Inklings, with the Demon and an Angel, getting double strike thanks to Richard. Before blocks, Doodle exiles a white card from his hand to evoke Solitude, exiling Demon of Fate's Design when it enters the battlefield, letting Jason gain 6 life since it had 6 toughness. Then, with the Solitude sacrifice trigger on the stack, he flashes in Whitemane Lion, returning Solitude to his hand to evoke it again, letting him exile another white card, and this time exiling the Angel with double strike when it enters, letting Jason gain 4 more life, then it's finally sacrificed to the evoke trigger. Finally, Doodle blocks an Angel with Yorion, killing it and taking 12. At this point, Richard and Jason agree that there isn't anything they can do to stop Doodle, so they both decide to concede, winning Doodle the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on in that game. Definitely some cool hits from Xantcha and, well, drains from Xantcha, and of course from everybody else. But let's actually start by talking about the winner of our game, which is Doodle and his Yorion deck. Very, very impressive win from Doodle. Definitely a lot of value coming from the mono white Yorion deck, which was very, very cool to see. Like I said, I'm a big fan of Yorion. I've got a deck of my own, so very cool to see what he could do by cutting a color. But it did do exactly what you would expect a Yorion deck to do. There was a ton of enter the battlefield, a ton of blink effects, a ton of flicker effects, and it was just like there was nothing the rest of the table could really do to stop him, because anytime something died, it just came back, or if something tried to be killed, then it would just come back because it was blinked, and it was just all around value and very, very impressive. Moving on to our next player, though, Richard. He got not really many of his Pillow Fort style cards. He got a lot more of his aggressive style cards, which is perfectly fine for Ishin. Definitely a strategy that works for plenty of Ishin decks. but I do think giving him Xantcha was definitely the right call because he was able to benefit from her attacking a lot more than the other players. Unfortunately for Richard, that also meant that he was the one getting drained by Xantcha, and he got drained for a lot of life by Xantcha throughout that entire game. Definitely put in more work. I think Xantcha actually did more damage to Richard through the life drain than she did to other players through combat, which is kind of funny, but overall, very, very impressive. Next up, we have Jason. He didn't get to do quite as much as he wanted. Unfortunately, got hit with a lot of graveyard hate. He did start to roll toward the end of it and got a lot of enchantress effects and drew a ton of cards, but it was a little bit too late because by the time he was ready to start swinging in, Doodle had just kind of become unstoppable, so Jason hit a bit of a brick wall with all of his blockers. But still, very, very impressive, and Anakthea never even hit the board, so I imagine that if she had, it would have been a very different game. And then, of course, last but not least, we got to talk about our own deck. I think that it performed very well. I think one of the major weaknesses is that we didn't have a lot of great defense, we didn't have a lot of blockers, and we didn't get enough goad synergies going on to really stop our opponents from hitting us. We obviously could not be hit with Xantcha, but there were other blockers in play. We couldn't find ways to make her unblockable or give her evasion, so we did struggle a little bit in that regard. And then I also think we struggled a bit with card draw. It would have been nice to find some ways to draw some more cards, so if you have suggestions for how I could improve that in the future, please do let me know. But overall, I do think the deck performed very well, and I am very happy with it, and it was a ton of fun to play. Very much felt like a slugfest from the very beginning. So thank you all so much for watching. Please let me know if you liked it, if you didn't like it, give me suggestions for future videos, give the video a like, and then, of course, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.